Hello, I'm Moltchanova. Thank you for watching my presentation. And I would also like to thank the organizers for making this conference happen. I'm looking forward to the online discussion. My paper, which is part of one chapter of my book manuscript, explains how the effects of implicit bias on the function of institutions challenge the model of joint collective actions put forward by Kirk Ludwig. I'm going to be reading since 20 minutes is a very short time for a presentation. All right. Institutional functioning involves a series of joint actions of individuals who are performing their institutional roles or status roles, which are a special kind of status functions. A joint action consists in there being multiple agents of a single event. It is jointly intentional when it is a result of the participants having we-intentions directed towards their bringing about the relevant event. A we-intention is an agent's intention directed at a group of which he is a member doing something in accordance with one and the same plan at the time of acting. Status functions are functions that an object, event, state of affairs, a person have in social transactions because the participants in the transaction collectively accept that they have this function. For example, a collectively recognized status of a dollar bill enables its function as currency. A collectively recognized status of a manager enables the individual's functioning in a leading institutional role. The agents who agree to the institutional arrangements and are accepted by others as meeting the conditions of membership in the group interconnect by performing status roles, and in doing so exercise or are subject to the exercise of certain powers. These powers are specified by the constitutive rules of the kind of action one has to perform vis-a-vis other institutional agents or groups in appropriate circumstances. Constitutive rules set out the conditions required to be met relative to the context for the action to be counted as performed. Although it may be a penumbral case, but John Bolton didn't complete the action of obtaining a permission for publishing his book because the condition that the permission is granted when a written letter has been dispatched to him wasn't met. Ludwig notes two forms of collective acceptance of repeated transactions as a kind of role object action and of a particular event or object of person. For example, there is a general collectively accepted group outcome-oriented intention, what Ludwig calls we-intention, to interact in the capacity of the institutional group member with managers in a certain way. This intention is conditional because it specifies that whenever one participates in the relevant transaction, one should behave in a certain way. And there is a de facto, the second kind, in each particular transaction, collective acceptance of the behavior of a particular manager is properly managerial. That one's intention in action accords with the conditional we-intentions pertaining to one's status role needs to be recognized by other agents performing their status roles, both for the action to be properly incorporated in the institution's functioning via the web of interlocking commitments, and for the agent to be properly included as the group member. Each agent following the rules in accordance with what their status role requires, therefore, ought also to be accepted by others as doing that at the time of action. Thus, the conditional and de facto collective acceptance shouldn't pull apart, and they normally don't for majority members. Yet, many real-life institutions formally operating based on egalitarian norms are affected by implicit bias that is triggered by stereotypes associated with who has historically performed institutional status roles. When minority members appropriately exercise their agency in fulfilling their status roles, their individual performances may not be collectively accepted and incorporated by the group in the same way as the equivalent status role performances by the majority. A variant of this is not being credited for a performance outcome that is fully utilized by the group and perfectly incorporated into its functioning. I will look at the effects of implicit bias with respect to gender, because I have first-hand experience with academia as a white foreign woman in the United States, but I expect that my conclusions apply to other types of implicit bias. Due to the data available in research, I'm only looking at cisgender women and men, not women identifying individuals or trans individuals, nor am I dealing with intersectionality. The formulation of institutional status roles as gender neutral overlays culturally shared social and institutional expectations or gender roles. Gender roles are associated with stereotypes, which are beliefs about the attributes associated with a social group. Implicit bias triggered by stereotypes associated with who has historically performed institutional status roles causes a non-uniform de facto collective acceptance of equivalent status role performances by women and men. Due to their perceived gender roles, people are expected to have psychological characteristics and abilities that equip them for the tasks that their gender has typically performed, both in the institution and in the larger society of which the institution was a part. For example, as a number of studies point out, the stereotype of a leader being culturally masculine poses a problem for women because the way they are stereotyped doesn't match what is expected from a leader. I call the first of the effects of implicit bias that I'm going to consider downgrading. On a standard view of status roles, doing X in circumstances C should count as Y. The circumstances obtain, the woman does X, but it counts for her as Y minus, or like less than Y as attributed to her. A female, for example, a female political candidate emphasizing male typical qualities like experience and knowledge faced backlash because she was considered as being too tough. In another example, assistant instructors in an online class, each operated under two different gender identities. Students rated the male course teacher significantly higher than the female identity course teacher, regardless of the instructor's actual gender. Literally, the same performance for status role resulted in different evaluation of the performance based on the perceived gender of the instructor. Across occupations, speaking up with positive ideas concerning change that indicate knowledge and care for the team improved group leadership status, but it improved it only for men, because a status claim must also be accepted by others. And when women spoke up with their ideas on how to change the team for the better, they weren't given more respect than the women who didn't speak up at all. In one experiment, men were given more credit than women, even when saying the exact same thing. The text was read in a male and female voice. Wilson and Sperber's relevance theory lends itself to a helpful interpretation of downgrading. Based on the relevance-guided comprehension heuristics, a listener tends to always follow a path of least effort in constructing an interpretation of the utterance, and to stop at first overall interpretation that satisfies his expectations of relevance. As comprehension is a form of richly context-dependent inference, stereotypes are an unavoidable part of the potentially relevant assumptions for the parties in the interaction. Due to implicit bias activated by stereotypes, the audience, taking the least effort or most productive for their cognitive processing path, sees a female speaker as a source less likely to pose insightful questions or offer important information or propose valuable solutions, and fails to understand the insightful question or to fully uptake the important information or to appreciate the valuable proposal. Instead, the audience gives a degraded interpretation of the woman's utterance and reacts to that. Wilson and Sperber distinguished between two types of meaning: linguistic meanings produced as an outcome of comprehension, which is conversationally shared, and speaker meanings. By analogy, we may say that institutional interlocking commitments are based not on a set of individual performances of what each agent perceives as their status role, call it performer meanings, but of these performances as accepted by the group and incorporated as such in the institutional functioning, institutional performance meanings. The second effect of implicit bias I would like to point out is the creation of what I call the de facto domain of status roles. The effect of implicit bias regularly lead to the groups habitually constructing, non-consciously, since the bias is implicit, and consequently perceiving only a specific kind of individuals as properly performing institutional status roles. This subtyping of the institutional group membership is historically conditioned and dynamically regenerated, as it creates what I will call the de facto domain of institutional actors. And domain here is related to its mathematical sense and refers to a set of individuals from the institutional setting whose performances can be matched with the corresponding conditionally collectively accepted constitutive rules for their status role. Only selected members of the group in implicit bias situations and environments are matched this way in collective acceptance of their particular performances. Specifically, focusing on the effects of implicit bias, one study found that women were asked, including by women in the evaluating investor panel, prevention-oriented questions. These are questions used for screening applicants out to disqualify ventures by determining their likelihood of failure. Men, on the other hand, were asked promotion-oriented questions. These are the questions that are used for screening the applicants in by approximating the likelihood of their success, because they are already presumed to be unquestionably qualified. Overall, those asked promotion-focused questions raise significantly higher amounts of funding than those asked prevention-focused questions. Thus, women were disproportionately screened out and received significantly less funding. An important feature of the situation is that women weren't perceived worse judged by the same criteria, because the same criteria, at least initially, didn't apply. Most women initially weren't part of the set of applicants deemed capable and qualified to be paired with the performance of conditionally collectively accepted institutional status role of a successful entrepreneur, and had to prove that they belong to the de facto domain to even start being compared to the majority of men. Another study shows that because women face stereotype-based negative performance expectations, they are given disproportionately less credit for the success they achieve when they work on tasks jointly with men, for whom performance expectations are more favorable. So I call the third effect of implicit bias, I'm going to look at non-attribution. When working with men, women were thought by evaluators to be generally less competent, less influential in achieving the team outcome, and less able to perform a leadership role in the task than their male counterparts. These effects weren't observed only when a detailed specification of what a woman did in the group project, or what her overall qualifications or previous successes were, was made explicit, very explicitly added to the data. That an institutional group may recognize and incorporate the outcome of a woman's functioning into the web of commitments that maintain the institution while not crediting her is illustrated by the history of a number of scientific discoveries made by women. Although the men on their team and not these women were given the credits, the outcome was valued by the scientific community, which is a roundabout acknowledgement that the women did perform their status role as judged by the criteria of performance imposed by the conditional and collectively accepted prior to the action by the women and their male colleagues' status role descriptions. What are the implications of the three effects of implicit bias for joint intentional institutional actions? Even if the conditions for a woman's status role performance obtain, her intentions and actions match the conditional re-intentions one takes on, generally speaking, in this kind of circumstance and performing the type of action that ought to be performed in the status role, and she acts accordingly. In the same way, other group members whose performance of the same role in the similar circumstances is unequivocally collectively accepted as appropriate, the power she enjoys and is subject to may be modified as compared to those enjoyed by the group members from the de facto domain, in this case men, through the downgrading or non-attribution of her performance in the de facto collective acceptance. I call the de facto collective acceptance of a woman's status role performance that results from implicit bias collective acceptance with an asterisk, or CA star, at least for the following reasons. Most group members are not aware that they unjustifiably downgrade or not attribute an otherwise fully appropriate performance. CA star may be split as far as the action and the actor are concerned. The formal terms of the woman's institutional membership are substituted in this type of collective acceptance. It places her outside of the de facto domain of the assigned status role. Collective acceptance of a woman's performance as inadequate or unsuccessful constructs her as not playing by the rules conditionally collectively accepted for the status role she was assigned to perform, in which doing X and C should count as Y, but counts as less or something else for her. This engenders a de facto different status function in operation. This also creates the need for her to really play by different rules in order to be perceived as performing well or as performing above the threshold level at all. For example, the female business applicant would counter prevention-oriented questions by redirecting the conversation instead of answering them, or a female politician would have to overcome the double bind and employ strategies that counter stereotypes and overall be very much overqualified for the position and so on. So they're performing different roles in a sense. According to Ludwig, a joint action is jointly intentional when it is the result of the participants having the intentions directed towards their bringing about the relevant event. Recall, the intention is an agent intention directed at a group of which he is a member doing something in accordance with one and the same plan at the time of acting. And what the implicit bias does that I discussed, when de facto collective acceptance of particular performances is influenced by it, a minority agent is prevented from meaningfully holding a V intention as both 1 and 2 are undermined. 1 doesn't obtain because the woman is constructed in CA star as not really a member of the group on the terms in which her membership is formally defined, and relative to which V intentions and group actions actually ought to be formulated. She cannot form a V intention directed at the group from which she is excluded. It should be also noted that she may form a V intention that guides her action in accordance with the conditional constitutive rules for her status role performance in achieving the group goal. But it doesn't matter much because it's only a performer meaning. It doesn't receive the institutional performance meaning as her performance is not paired in CA star with the status role that defines her membership in the group as conditionally collectively accepted. She may even accept that she is not competent enough because she suffers from stereotype threat, but even if she goes along with how her performance is accepted, she is still not a full member of the institutional group as defined in the initial terms of membership she assumes are operational. In addition, if she consciously dissociates from how her performance is evaluated, she may not be able to form a V intention as a group member. For institutional actors' commitment to interlock, to realize one and the same plan at the time of acting, each actor following the rules in accordance with what their status role requires ought also to be accepted by others as doing that at the time of action. So 2 does not obtain because CA star of a woman's status role performance constructs it as something that doesn't correspond to what the group has conditionally collectively accepted as a proper course of action in conformity with the group plan. Thus, the institutional performance meaning of her intention is not constructed as directed at the same plan at the time of acting. Since participants work jointly by relating to one another through doing what's appropriate for their role in achieving the group goal, and her performance is deemed as not appropriate for her status role, she cannot relate to the group goal because she cannot relate to one another through doing what is appropriate for her role in achieving the group goal, since it's not, it doesn't have that institutional meaning. Women may not be able to share a plan at the time of acting with the rest of the group because they are not properly accepted as group members or dissociate from the group. Their status role performance is constructed via collective acceptance by the rest of the group as not corresponding to the description given in the shared plan, and they are possibly playing by different rules. Therefore, the effects of implicit bias challenge the model of intentions in joint collective actions put forward by Ludwig. A model of institutional functioning that takes implicit bias into account should calibrate for the status distortion function, or perhaps status function distortions that affects both the membership standing of institutional participants and the incorporation of the outcomes of their status role performance. The model cannot rely on institutional status role performance being normally credited with the outcomes of their actions and being included in the webhook interlocking commitments in accordance with their exhibited agential capacity, because it is often not the case in the environments affected by implicit bias. Thank you. And if you liked my presentation, there is going to be a modeling remediation video with my suggestions of what might be done to model situations with implicit bias. Thanks.